consultants going with USAID money to Eastern Europe and to Russia with their advice. Many of them had absolutely no knowledge of the culture of the country they were working in. They came in, as Sachs did, with cookie-cutter solutions. This worked in Bolivia, this worked in Poland, surely it'll work in Russia. And really with this kind of sense that we have the answers. Aren't you lucky we're here? We're going to give you the answers. We're going to make our money. Big, fat contracts, as Waddell shows. I have to say, with some embarrassment, my own institution, Harvard University, from which I have 3 degrees, was very much culpable in this time. They got a no-bid contract from USAID. Sachs was the head of something called the Harvard Institute of International Development. Harvard sent its consultants over, got very close to Tobias and some of the other people doing the privatization. There was an awful lot of kind of quick inside dealing that went on. A couple of the Harvard consultants were playing the Russian stock market and making money with their inside knowledge. All of this blew up in about 1997. There were congressional hearings and the contract was canceled. It was a black eye for Harvard University, but unfortunately it was symbolic of some of the wrong approach that took place during this period that really didn't understand that Russians had a tremendous amount of pride. Sure, their country had gone through difficult times, but that didn't mean that they were like little school children with absolutely no knowledge and no civilizational identity. And Russia at this time, of course, was going through a kind of a national identity crisis. We're no longer the empire of the czars. We're no longer the multinational federation of the Soviets. Who are Russians? What is our role in the world? These were the kinds of things they were struggling with, and the United States was, in effect, giving them the back of its hand. So here's the rest of the story then, unfortunately, and a lot of it has to do with this man, Vladimir Putin, who has really been the power broker, the chief power in Russian politics since late 1999. There was a background here of the war in Kosovo in 1999 against Serbia, where, as you remember, NATO intervened on behalf of the Albanian minority in this province of Serbia. This offensive war by NATO without UN Security Council approval, and where Russia would have vetoed it, took a piece of territory away from Serbia, Russia's longtime friend and ally, and the Russians said, hey, wait a minute, this is not the way the post-Cold War order is supposed to work. That came right on the heels of a collapse of the Russian economy. The ruble was devalued. Russia defaulted on some of its international debt. So there was economic chaos. There was this foreign policy humiliation. The West, under both Clinton and Bush, was pushing for further enlargement of NATO, and now they were talking about bringing Ukraine and Georgia, other Russian republics, into NATO, which Russia saw as an anti-Russian move, and building missile defenses, allegedly against, in the late 1990s already, against some Iranian threat, but the Russians saw that as another indication of the hostility that remained from Cold War-era politics. Putin, after the attack on the United States by the terrorists in September of 2001, 9/11, Putin was the first to reach out to Bush and really say, hey, look, let's put this behind us. Let's go back and really think about a genuine partnership. We, the Russians, have been victims of terror more often than you. Unfortunately, you now see what we're dealing with in Chechnya and elsewhere. Let's have some partnership. Let's talk about ways of cooling off this eagerness to expand NATO, stopping the talk about a missile defense. Let's keep the ABM treaty. How about cooperating on stopping some of the ending some of the Cold War barriers to trade, particularly the Jackson-Vanik Amendment? Maybe even help Russia get into the World Trade Organization. That was Putin's agenda, looking for cooperation. In return, he gave valuable help for the initial U.S. thrust into Afghanistan, where the Russians, of course, had had some very sad experiences, but of very great knowledge and intelligence. offered cooperation on sanctions against Iran, a number of other things. Again, he got the back of Mr. Bush's hand. He was invited to the ranch, and there was a lot of falderall, but as far as the actual agenda that the Russians had, it didn't happen. One of the things the Russians wanted was to keep the issue of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction in the United Nations and to work that out through inspections. But the U.S. grew impatient and invaded Iraq in March of 2003, 20 years ago. Though the French and the Germans were really more active in opposing that than the Russians, you remember Condoleezza Rice said, we're going to punish the French. We're going to ignore the Germans. We'll forgive the Russians. So again, a kind of a condescension. They're not really taking their interests into account. Same time with this talk about bringing Georgia and Ukraine, vital areas for Russia, into NATO, beginning an aggressive push toward making U.S. positions in Central Asia the dominant influence there over Russia's influence or China's. Here you have Cheney, Vice President Cheney, meeting with Nursultan Nazarbayev, the seemingly president for life of Kazakhstan. This is right after Cheney had given a speech in Lithuania in which he condemned Russia for its retrograde democratic development, and then he went and made nice with someone who's far less democratic than Mr. Putin. And so here, you know, with the outbreak of the war in Georgia in 2008, this cartoon appeared in the New Yorker. This is one that I have on my office door. And there you have the folks sitting around in Washington under a map of Russia, and the gentleman at the head of the table saying, the return of the Cold War. Am I the only one who feels like I'm putting on a comfortable pair of old shoes? And I have this cartoon to say that some of this failure of partnership, some of this hostility through the end of the 90s and into the decade of the 2000s was not simply as a result of the events that took place then, but a hangover of some of the suspicions, some of the stereotypes, and quite frankly on both sides. When Putin made the gesture toward Bush, what he was really doing was also facing down some of the sort of unreconstructed Cold Warriors in his own foreign ministry and defense ministry. It was a real gamble. But those unreconstructed Cold Warriors still exist on Capitol Hill and in some of the bureaucracies in our country as well as in Russia. Part of the issue for the Russians, really obviously, is that for them, the U.S. still matters tremendously. It matters for the development of their economy, particularly the petroleum industry. It matters for a security partnership. But for the Americans, Russia is, and I heard this from one of Medvedev's top advisors in September, that he said, well, maybe we're number 20 on your list of concerns. So we really don't pay a lot of attention to Russia's interests when they express them. And the Russians then feel wounded by that. The best example is when we finally got around to repealing the Jackson-Vanik 1974 Soviet-era restrictions on U.S.-Russian trade, and the Congress followed that the very same day with the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which would punish Russians who were involved in the mistreatment of this human rights, or actually more of an economist lawyer, in a Russian jail. The Russians, of course, followed. They overreacted. The Duma, full of nationalists, said, well, we're not just going to punish American officials who are involved in Guantanamo or something like that. What we're going to do is we're going to end the practice of adoption of Russian orphans by America.